Carl, thanks a lot. And we miss you here in Budapest. And good afternoon, everyone. Carl forgot to mention that, well, you did kind of mention the passing that he spent quite a bit of many years here with us. So let me start a technology to kind of be able to share my slides. And, today I would like to speak a little bit about the work that my lab has done in the area of science, but in particular kind of focusing on what we often jokingly call in the lab, the science of success. And you will see what is that and why are we there. And so to get it started, of course, as Carl mentioned, I'm a network scientist, and I do define myself as a network scientist to the degree that I actually have, my official title is Professor of Network Science. And I do sit in two different departments, each of them having networks in its name, which means that as a network scientist, I study lots of different types of networks, like the internet for many years, and lately a lot focusing on, for example, on the subcellular network within our cell systems, which is what you see over here in this particular video, and which is the reason, for example, that I have the Harvard Medical School appointment. There we have a division of network medicine where we have about 200 doctors kind of using the network paradigm to think about new cures and diseases. And one of the things that actually kind of always bothered me with network science, or at the same time excited me, but also bothered me, is the fact that much of the work, at least that my lab has done, has been focusing on the large-scale structure of the network. How do networks look like? How do you describe it mathematically? How do you understand its evolution, its dynamics, as well as its existing structural patterns? But very little has been actually said, at least in my lab for many years, about what does the network do to a node? Because at the end, most of the things that we care about, particularly ourselves, we are nodes within the network. We interact with others, and to some degree, the network actually shapes, many aspects of our life. And so a few years ago, actually now almost 10 years ago, Dashun Wang was a student of mine in the lab, and we were kind of throwing our idea that, like, could we really go in that direction? And in particular, we thought that, particularly in the area of science, we're so embedded in these scientific networks, and probably these networks will be defining to some degree our career options. And how could we use all this data that was just emerging about scientific productivity, publications, and so on, and combine it with the network story to talk about somehow success in science? And as we started to think about it, we realized that really, we have to go a little bit back in order to address that question, because it's not enough to think about networks, but we also have to kind of ask ourselves, what does it, what does it mean to have success, for example, in the scientific context? What does it mean to have performance and so on? And in particular, we said, what do these quantities really mean? And as we kind of went into depth into this problem, we realized that there are these two problems that we often talk about, two notions when it comes to, life in science, which is performance and maybe what we would call recognition or success. And we use them interchangeably, meaning that, that kind of, we assume that they're very, very deeply connected and often indistinguishable. But the deeper we look into that, we realize that these are very, very different quantities when it comes to what you measure about a particular individual. And particularly because when it comes to performance, it's something that you do. That is, what do you publish? What's the content? How much do you publish, and so on? And many measures that we call success or recognition is not as much about you, but it's about how much of what you do the community notices. How much do they acknowledge, and whether they reward you for that or not? In other words, if we kind of think about performance and success, we realize that your performance is about you, but your success is really about us. Because we as a community really confer success to the individual. And we'll see in a second of how that actually plays out in a particular area. One place to think about is really citations that are often used and misused when it comes to scientific success. And citations is not something that we give it to ourselves. It's something that the community provides to us. Now let's go a step further and say, what's the relationship between performance and success? And the problem, if you try to address that question, comes when you realize that it's very difficult to measure performance, at least in science, but we can measure it in some other areas. And areas where you can easily measure performance is really sports. And you can also have many measures of success. And it's very interesting how we talk about somebody who is like an elite, an elite player, for example, like Novak Djokovic. And we would say, well, we have many measures of success or performance about him. We can talk about how many people search for him on Google, what's his ranking, how many points he collected, how often did he win, did he lose, how many people visit his Wikipedia pages, and obviously money, right? How much did he win and how much did he earn? And these are all things that people who are into tennis, kind of numbers that they throw around as they compare players. But when you actually look at these numbers, you realize that here we are nonchalantly mixing performance and success together. Because what you have on the left-hand side are things that are purely performance measure. Did he win or did he lose? That's a performance measure. It depends on his ability to play in that particular game. Score points are deeply connected to the losses and wins. Ranking is connected, and winnings is also connected. Did he win the tournament or not? However, when it comes to Google searches, Wikipedia visits, and endorsements, these are things that, yes, they are driven by performance, but they are success measures because they are conferred by us to him, right? We search for him on Google, we visit his Wikipedia page, and we actually interested in him as a person, and that draws actually endorsements down the line. So now, since performance and success are so deeply connected, we said maybe we can actually predict that, right? Could we actually use performance measure to predict success? And for that, we decided to look at simply the Wikipedia page views. It's a measure of the one measures of success of how many people have visited every week his Wikipedia page. And when you look in function of time, you see that this is the time when he was not yet a well-known player. So, you know, people visited, but not as many. But then as he started winning major tournaments, you know, you would have, you know, orders of 1 million people coming at certain moments, certain weeks to his webpage. And this is, of course, again, a success measure because it's a community measure we provided to him. And we were curious if we could build a formula that would predict that entirely from performance measures. And we did. And this is how the formula looks like. And what is interesting about the formula is that what you have on the right is are only things connected to performance, whether did he win or lose, what was the ranking difference between the person against to win, what was the prestige level of the competition he was present, how many years he has been playing so far, and so on. And of course, on the left-hand side, we're trying to predict the Wikipedia page views. And how well does it work? Pretty well, right? If you see what the formula predicts, which is the red line, relatively closely matches actually the real data. And of course, what we do here is that as he has the performance, we plug into the formula and get right away how many people will visit. So it works very well. Why does this formula work? Well, the reason why it works is because performance drives success, particularly when it comes to sports. And this is what your teacher and your coach had been telling you for many, many years, right, in school, that you have to exercise, you have to go to practice, you have to study, because that will give you success. So generally performance and success are things. When we look deeper, they aren't so deeply connected. And to understand that, I'm going to make actually a statement that it may sound strange first, but we're going to elaborate. What I'm going to say is that performance is bounded, but success is unbounded. What do we mean by that? Well, let's talk about performance first. You know, one area where we can measure performance, obviously, is sports, and running is the easiest because we have a one-dimensional measure of performance, which is speed. And what you see here is the fastest man on earth, as he's often called. And what is interesting about it is that even though he wins most of the competitions he participates, and this is all Usain Bolt, obviously, when you look at the numbers, or let's say the edge he has over the other runners, it turns out that he's not so much better than anybody else. The speed difference between him and number one, that is the one who loses the competition, is typically of the order of 1%. So here I'm actually showing you the fastest people on earth when it comes to running, sprinting, and you see Usain Bolt has a bunch of records, but then when you look at the number 2 and number 3, really the difference is really tiny. And this is not only true in running. It turns out that in any areas where we can measure performance, the performance between the top performers is virtually indistinguishable. And so virtually indistinguishable that even in sports where we have chronometers and we have videos and everything, we often cannot decide who is the best. So let me give an example close to our home. You know, at the Rio Olympics, Phelps, Lacrosse, and Chet, the Hungarian swimmer, had to actually share the silver prize in a three-way tie, not because it wasn't clear who came in first, because the video showed precisely who arrived first. But the reason why they had to share the three-way tie is because the time difference between the number 1, number 2, and number 3 was less than what it takes to swim the 2.5 centimeter accuracy of the swimming pool itself. That is, the swimming pool has been only certified to 2.5 centimeters, and the time difference was under what it takes to swim that. So think about it. If not even in sports, we can decide who is the fastest swimmer, how are we going to decide who is the best scientist based on performance alone? Who is the best teacher? Who is the best businessman, and so on? And this is what we see over and over, that when it comes to performance is very bounded, meaning at the top, the individuals are indistinguishable. However, and in most areas that we really care about it, it's virtually impossible to measure. This is not to say that you cannot distinguish strong performers from weak performers. What I'm saying is that among the top performers, the difference is negligible and often not measurable. So that's what it means performance is bounded. And mathematically what it means, that every time you are able to measure performance distributions, they follow an exponential or a faster decaying distribution, meaning that there are no outliers when it comes to performance. There's no one who runs 10 times faster than the number 2. Now, success is different. And let me give you an example of where I first kind of realized that. So in 2009, when my second book, Burst, came out, I was in New York talking with my editor, and we were just curious, you always hope, of who was on the bestseller list that week. And there was some superb competition. That week, The Lost Symbol came out by Dan Brown and The Last Song by Nicholas Sparks. And both were giant books in terms of audience. And when you just looked at the New York Times bestseller list, it looked like if Nicholas Sparks' team works a little better, he could almost be number 1, or could be number 1. And there is something to argue that perhaps the Sparks write much better than Brown, and why wouldn't he be number 1, right? But when you look at the numbers, then a different picture kind of encounters you. So these are the Nicholas Sparks sales in function of the time in that period. And you see when it comes out, he sells more than 100,000 copies, which is a giant number for 1 week. Because normally you actually end up on the New York Times bestseller list by selling about 5,000 copies that week. And you typically are number 1 if you sell somewhere between 10 to 30,000 copies. He was over 100,000, so he certainly deserved to be number 1. Why wasn't he number 1? Because there was Dan Brown, who sold 1.2 million copies that week. So here we have outliers, right? While in performance, the difference is indistinguishable between the top players. When it comes to success measures, which is conveyed by the community, then the difference can be orders of magnitude more, because it doesn't require more effort from the creator to actually get more success. And that's really mathematically, when you measure success measures, whether how many books different authors are selling, how many citations different scientists are getting, how much money people earn, you always find fat tail distributions, power law-like distributions, indicating that you have outliers. And in a fat distribution, you always have a number one who's not just 1% better than number two, but typically several times more kind of going towards the number one. So this is what I said, performance is bounded and success is unbounded. And this is a statement that is generally true in most areas of human performance and areas of success. But what I'd like to do now is to kind of take these ideas to back closer to home, because I assume that the mass majority of you are scientists or wannabe scientists. And the question is, how does this really play out in our own career? How does the career of a scientist look like from the perspective of performance and success? And I'm going to show you a career that I'm most familiar with, which is my own, obviously. And you can actually see how my career unfolded, in time. So I published my first paper in 1989, and then vertically, what you see is how many citations you got. And when you see at the first 10 years of my career, you see I worked a lot. I published lots of papers, but there wasn't much interest in them. There wasn't much impact. So this was that stage of my career, right? And then something happened about 10 years into my career. And what happened is that I changed subjects and I became interested in networks and virtually turned all my lab over to study networks. And, that was a great time because one big impact paper after the other one was actually following in a relatively short time frame. So what happened around here was really that stage of my career. Everything felt great and nothing could go wrong, right? And then the question, of course, what happens here? And partly we don't know what happens here because there hasn't been enough time to accumulate citations because it takes time to do so. But when you look at the data, things have quieted a little bit down. So maybe I am in that stage of my career. And the question is really, where are we and what do you really normally expect in a scientific career? And in order to do that, we were curious, is there a possibility that we could actually see from the data that a major discovery is going to happen, that science is going to break through and will pretty much discover something big. And in order to do that, we were curious, what happens around the moment when the scientist publishes his or her highest impact paper. So in my case, this was the 63rd paper, which was 13 years into my career. And I do want to emphasize that this is not the total number of citations, but what we call C10, the number of citations acquired within 10 years, which is kind of a better measure of immediate impact in the community than the total one, because the total one can have very, very long tails occasionally. So we said, let's see what happens in the vicinity for all scientists of that point when the highest impact paper happens in his or her career. And that could be later or earlier, doesn't matter. For every scientist, we found the highest peak, and we said what happens before and after. And so we said, let's look first at productivity. So this is the moment when the scientist publishes their highest impact papers. Again, we shifted the career of all scientists to put in the middle at T star that particular paper. And we said, how does productivity change leading to that moment and what happens after that? And the data indicated that there is actually a pretty clear signal that as scientists are approaching that work, they work harder and harder and harder, that they publish more and more. This is productivity, how many papers per year the scientist publishes until they hit that big discovery. Of course, they don't know that's their big discovery because they may hope that there's something more coming in, but here something remarkable happens. And what's interesting that after that, it doesn't go any further, but it kind of saturates. And what you see here is a curve that is well known in pretty much in the psychology literature. When people look how individuals learn music or certain sports and things like that, that there is a period of fast learning. And then once you learn how to play a piano, for example, you will know how to play the piano the rest of the year, and only with years will slowly degrade if you don't practice, but fundamentally it will be there with you. And that's what we see. So there is actually a signal as you are coming, and the productivity does improve until the largest hit. But what happens about impact, the success? Do we see actually papers getting higher and higher impact as we're approaching this high impact work? So we did the same curve again, and unfortunately there wasn't much signal. So this is how many citations the papers before the highest impact paper got, and after that. And that was very disappointing, the lack of signal. And we even named this curve, we called it the finger curve, because what it's telling us really is that we can see success coming, and nor do we seem to learn from it. So there's a success in terms of productivity, there's a signal, but there is no signals in terms of doing higher and higher impact papers. Just the biggest paper just suddenly emerges almost from nothing, which is great because it could be the next paper for any of us, right, in our career, which raises the question, when does that happen? At what age does it happen? At what stage of the career? And there are very, very strong feelings about that throughout the ages within the scientific literature. And they were actually kind of formulated by Albert Einstein, who once said, a person who has not made his great contribution to science before the age of 30 will never do so. Now, that's a pretty strong statement. And the question is, why would he make such a statement at all? And the reason why he made that statement is because he looked around himself and looked at the scientists that he appreciated or admired. And that was pretty much the quantum mechanics generation. And what he realized that most of the people have made their discoveries in the kind of mid to late 20s, maybe early 30s. There was only one outlier, maybe two in that group, or three, Maxwell, Schrödinger, and Planck. And Planck was always called the big old man of quantum mechanics. And indeed, he came relatively late to the subject, but he was one of the early ones to think about that. So in general, that what Einstein formulated is a belief that is strongly held among many scientists, that creativity is something of the purview of the young individual, and with age that goes away. So we were curious, is this true? Is this really true for ordinary scientists? Let's not worry about Nobel Prize winners for a second. And for that, what we did is went back to the same idea that we had before, and we said, how many years into the scientific career does the biggest discovery come into? So that we don't actually know the ages of all scientists. You know the ages of Nobel Prize winners because they have Wikipedia pages. But for scientists, for us, age is really the kind of the academic age. And your age starts clicking when you publish your first paper. And when we call academic age is how many years has passed from your first publication. That's what's measurable to us. So we said, let's identify for each scientist that T-star moment. And here's how it looks like. So what you see here is a bunch of physicists. Each line is a career of a different physicist. And these are close careers. These are mostly careers that started in the 1950s and 60s. And by now they stopped publishing because we wanted to see full careers, not just kind of unfolding careers. And whenever there's a red dot, it means that for that particular scientist, that was the paper in his or her career that had the highest impact. Some of these papers may be a Nobel Prize winning discovery with a giant impact. Others could be just the personal best, right? Not remarkable discoveries, but it was the personal best for that particular scientist. So the question is, how are these distributed in terms of time, in terms of the academic age? So we look at the distribution, that's what you do, right? This is the probability that you will have your highest impact paper published 10, 20, or 30 years into your academic career. And when you look at the data, it's somewhat discouraging, right? Particularly for someone like me, and I'll get to that in a second, right? Because it shows that your highest chance, your highest impact work really comes pretty much in the first 20 years of your career. And after that, the chances of publishing the chances that you will publish your highest impact work more than 20 years into your career, it vanishes very, very fast. So fast, in fact, that I'm about 30 years into my career and I have less than 1% chance to publish something higher impact than I did before, which means that I'm really in that stage of my career. But is this true? And you know, many of you are probably in computational social science, and you know that you cannot simply take raw data on face value. We need controls. And what is the control here? Well, the control would be, is that what would happen if it would be totally random when we publish our highest impact paper? And that's easy to do because we just take the same scientific careers that we had before, and then we're going to shuffle, not the papers. Everybody will have the same list of publications, but we're going to shuffle the impact of the papers among each other. So we randomize the impact of each scientist's career, otherwise leaving everything the same when they publish their paper and so on. And then we said, how does this curve look in the case of a randomized career? And we were in for some surprise because there was no difference whatsoever from the randomized and the real curve. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's pack it up. Well, the randomized career really means that I assign randomly the highest impact paper to any work. It effectively, if you think deeply, it measures the productivity of how many papers you publish per year, because the more you publish, the higher the chance that that paper will be the highest impact, right? So that's purely productivity. And what we effectively see is that the success curve and the productivity curve are totally indistinguishable, which practically means that there is no really time dependence on when the highest impact paper comes. It's totally random within a scientist's career. And to be more precise, you see, if you take a bunch of scientists and you put their papers from the first and the last, each dot is a paper, and the orange dot is the highest impact paper, then you see that the likelihood the orange dot will appear in the first 10% of your career or the last or the middle is exactly the same for all scientists. So really, that kind of indicates, if you kind of realize that when it comes to success, it really, you never know when your hit comes. It could be with the same probability, the first or the last or the middle paper of your career. So what this data indicates, that idea that young people are the one who make discoveries is purely a productivity bias. It is when we are young, we are eager to publish a lot. We want to kind of discover things. And with age, the productivity decreases for many reasons. There are administrative reasons. We take up administration. We get involved in other projects that may not lead to scientific papers, book writing, textbook writing, and so on, and productivity goes down. But creativity or the ability to publish a high impact paper doesn't. And in a way, publishing their highest paper is like a lottery. You pick a paper and could be the next one, totally random within that perspective. And let me show you an example of that. So as I said, these are different careers, and these three, the dark lines, are Nobel Prize winning careers. And I'm going to show you actually here two examples. The Frank Wilczek example, who got the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2004 for the very, very first paper that he ever published within his career. He was a graduate student. Together with his advisor, they published a paper for which 40 years later, he was awarded the Nobel Prize. But the biggest story is not him. The more interesting studies is John Flynn, who got in 2002, 2 years earlier, the Chemistry Nobel Prize. And he did so for a discovery that he did after he was officially retired from Yale University. And his is a wonderful story because when he reached 65, at that time in the US, you could actually force retire faculty. It's not allowed any longer. And at age 65, his lab was closed at Yale University, which was kind of an invitation to give up and move on. And he was an experimental chemist. And he ended up moving to Virginia Commonwealth University, which is a much less ranked institution than Yale. And it was there that he made, after his official retirement, the discovery that ended up giving him the Nobel Prize about 15 years later. And he actually passed away about 3 years ago. He was 90 something when he was passed away. And a week before he passed away, he was still in the lab working. So he's a wonderful example of that creativity and ability to make discoveries has no age. Productivity does, right? The willingness to try again. But the scientists who keep trying and don't give up could hit big at any age of their career. Now, with that, let me kind of switch gears. So this was much about the timing of the biggest discovery, and talk about another acute problem when it comes to success in science, which is the idea of credit. That is, who gets the credit and how for a particular discovery. And that's a very important question because the way we do science has changed. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at Einstein, there was no question about that who would get the credit for a relativity theory, both the special as well as general relativity, because the paper had only one author, Einstein. So there was no ambiguity of where should say the Nobel Prize or the credit should go. Same was true for Darwin. But Darwin and science lived in a different age. And we don't work any longer alone. We cannot accomplish much in science alone. And rather we collaborate. And when we collaborate, the big question comes up. When you have 5 or 10 people on the paper, who gets the credit for the discovery? Like, how would you decide who of these individuals should get the Nobel Prize, given that this is actually a Nobel Prize winning paper? And it is. Well, obviously these 2 authors, right? So the question is, how does the community decide who among so many people, and many of which who had essential contribution to the discovery, should be really elevated to be honored for that particular discovery? And that was really the question that we were kind of asking. And to go back a little bit, let me see if I can move my mouse in the system. No, I cannot do that. Okay. Anyway, so we were actually curious about how does this process actually happen and how is the decision being made in general. And let me show you 2 examples to show that. So we have actually a paper for which a Nobel Prize has been awarded in 2010, and it was by Baba and Negishi. And Negishi got the Nobel Prize. And the question is, why is that? Because there are only 2 authors in the paper. And when you actually look at the 5 most co-cited papers with the Nobel Prize winning discovery, that is, what are the papers that the community co-cites with the 1976 paper, it turns out that there are 5 papers, all by Negishi as the first author, and Baba is missing. So when you look at that track record, you realize that whatever that discovery was in 1976, it was part of the journey, the scientific journey of Negishi. And perhaps Baba may have had important contribution, but was really not part of the whole development of the idea, right? And if we look at the physics Nobel Prize in 2010, which went for graphene to Noselov and Gain, when we look at the 5 most co-cited papers with the prize-winning paper, all of them have both Gain and Noselov together. So therefore, not surprisingly, they're indistinguishable when it comes to what it leads to that particular discovery, and they both actually got the Nobel Prize. Interestingly, this is not just a hunch, but we can quantify this notion, what we see here. The idea that who really deserves the Nobel Prize is there in the community's mind, and it's already reflected in the way we cite papers. That is, we co-cite the main inventors' papers, other papers, and the others are just there for the ride, and we may not co-cite their papers for that. And to do that, we ended up writing an algorithm, which is a very interesting matrix formula that works like that. Let's assume that we have a paper written by 2 authors, the red and the green person, and we would like to figure out who gets how much of the 2 of them, how much credit in the community's mind for the discovery. So therefore, we're going to find all the papers that cite this. These are the papers that cite that particular paper, but also cite any other paper by the 2 co-authors of this paper. And in this case, what we realized that 3 of the papers were by the red authors, and only 1 had actually the green author on them. And then, of course, they co-cited other papers that none of them was on it. And using this idea, we can actually go ahead and kind of get the weight of how much each author gets, which eventually turned into a compact matrix formula, which is over here. The credit share is a matrix times this particular vector that you get over here. And if you apply to this particular situation, what the formula would tell us is that 67% of the credit goes to the red author and 30% of the credit goes to the green author in this particular case. So let's generalize that. This can be applied to any number of co-authors and can be also applied to papers that are competing with each other but are not necessarily one single paper with multiple authors. And when we apply to it, the formula tells us that in this case, Negishi gets 72% of the credit and Baba gets 28%. And when it comes to Nocello and Gabe, it's 50-50%. So fine, we have a formula that works all right in these two particular cases. How do we know that the formula does work in general? Well, in order to test that, we need to find situations where the community has publicly decided who kind of should get the credit. And of course, the good example of that is the Nobel Prize itself. And we actually looked at the Nobel Prize since 2013 because that was the year when the committee started to publicly publish what are the papers for which the prize has been given. Before that, it was just the individual mentioned and the nature of the discovery, but they would not actually give the supplementary material that would pinpoint to the paper. So since 2013, we have that. And then we apply to the formula. So what you see is each year is a Nobel Prize in physics or chemistry. And we have how many papers, how many co-authors the paper had, right? And we give ourselves a red dot if the formula was currently predicting that should be the person to get the prize. And obviously we get ourselves a black dot if we missed. That is, we wrongly predicted who should be the Nobel Prize winner. And you see, luckily we get mostly red dots, but we occasionally get a black dot. And we looked into each of the black dots, of course, because we're curious. And to be honest, all of them were very interesting stories. Never was a clear-cut situation. But let me actually tell you one story that is particularly memorable, and I think we can learn a lot from that. And that's the 2008 Chemistry Nobel Prize that went for a very important discovery in biology, the so-called GFP molecule. The GFP molecule is the molecule that kind of creates these beautiful fluorescent green colors that you see when you look at Petri dishes that the biologists publish regularly in their papers. It's a molecule that you can tag to certain genes and will light up. So you will see whether the gene or the protein is active or present or not in the cell. And the Nobel Prize was given to Shimamura Shalfi and Tseng for discovering it. And oddly, our formula insisted that the prize should actually have gone instead to this fellow Douglas Fraser. Now, what was particularly odd about that particular prediction is that when we were looking for Fraser, we could not find him active anywhere. There was no indication that he would have passed away. He was a scientist on his rank, and he did publish on GFP, but he was not to be found in any university or any research institution. And eventually, not us, a journalist managed to track him down, and he was a van driver at a car dealership. That he was the person that if your car broke down, he would actually drive you home and then would come you pick you up and it's fixed. So why did our formula insisted that the van driver should get the Nobel Prize for chemistry that year? Well, because he was a scientist, and he was a scientist at Woods Hole. And he was the first person to have the idea that the fact that the jellyfish do light up, they're fluorescent, that there is perhaps one molecule or one gene responsible for that. And this was way before the Genome Project, the Human Genome Project. So he has spent quite a bit of time of collecting a giant number of jellyfish and try to isolate the gene, which was a very laborious process at that time, that may be responsible for the fluorescence property. And he succeeded. He did find the fluorescent gene, the one that produces the GFP protein. And he did so because he knew what is this going to be good for. Because if he finds one protein, then he can use that protein to attach it to other proteins and other molecules. And it could be used as a tracer in the cell. So when he discovered the protein itself, then he wrote a grant proposal asking for money to do the next step, which is to really reintroduce the protein into other cells and use it as a marker. And unfortunately, his grant got turned down. And you know, we all have grants that got turned down in our career, and we just move on and write another one and write another one. Instead, he got so disappointed that he just simply gave up his job at Woods Hole and moved to do research in industry. Eventually, he lost that job as well. That institute was closed, and step by step, he ended up being a van driver. Now, question is, why did Roger Tsien and Martin Schaffy got the prize? Well, Douglas Fraser, when he closed his lab at Woods Hole, and he knew he's not going to do more research on GFP, he did something very interesting. He filled 2 files with the gene that he discovered, and he sent it to the only people who showed any interest in his research at that time, which was Martin Schaffy and Roger Tsien. He sent them the gene. And then it was Martin Schaffy and Roger Tsien who did what he could not do because he didn't get the money to do, and eventually were credited for the discovery. And Shimamura eventually developed this much further, the technology in a separate track. So why didn't actually Fraser get the Nobel Prize? Partly because he was not part of the network of the community. He was nowhere to be found. We couldn't find him either for a while. And hence, probably nobody actually commended it. He was not part of the scientific enterprise. He was not part of the network that is responsible for the mergers of the credit within the scientific community. So it is a beautiful example that performance alone is not sufficient. You also have to actually be acknowledged for that discovery. And he, by quitting science early on, right after his discovery, he didn't put that word behind that to be acknowledged for that. And apparently we as a community are not good enough to do so if we don't know the person who we are trying to acknowledge. So what is really important here is that credit is based on perception and not on performance. So it's not enough to have the exceptional performance, particularly in areas where performance is hard to measure, but you also actually need to get the credit for it, and you need to work hard for that. And that's what I often tell always my students and postdocs. When we publish a great paper together, I say, okay, congratulations. Now you made a discovery, which means you have performance. But now you have to get the credit for it. And you need to realize that any paper you and I publish together is my paper because they don't know you that yet. So now you need to go out in the community and number one, give a bunch of talks about discovery so they get to know you and they start crediting you for that. And the credit will slowly switch from me to you. And second of all, you need to make other discoveries in the same area independent of me so that the credit will gradually shift towards you. And in that case, it will. Now, let's see, we're 42 minutes into that. So let me tell you a final story when it comes to performance and credit, and particularly in the situation where performance is what is impossible to measure. And let me switch actually to this one here. And that is the example of art, right? How much is this piece of art worth? And of course, depending on where you see it, if you see it in a trash house, you would have to pay someone to take it away. If you see in a yard sale, you may get it for $5, right? And if you buy it new, you may set you back for $100 or $200. But of course, this, as many of you know, this is a very famous artwork by Marcel Duchamp, and it's worth tens of millions of dollars. And this is the example that I like to use to show that in art, performance is inherently unmeasurable, because you cannot look at the object itself, divorced from the context, and decide what is the value. Because the value of this object depends on who put it there, who claimed that this is an artwork, who purchased it, what museums, what galleries have exhibited it, how does it relate to other works within the art history and the career of the same artist, and what reference did it get over time, and so on. So at the end, art is a wonderful example where performance is inherently unmeasurable. There is no algorithm, no one has been able to do that, that looks at the objects without context and could actually assign value to that. And so therefore, art is a wonderful example of a situation where recognition, value, and success are determined by invisible networks. That is, reference networks of how this artwork and the artist connect to the whole body of art that happened before and after that. So for that reason, and for other reasons, because I have a personal interest in art, we actually were curious, could we somehow quantify success in the art space? And we were lucky a few years ago because we got a unique data set that allowed us to reconstruct the full career of almost 500,000 artists. And by getting their exhibition history in 140 countries from 1980 to 2016, which include about almost 500,000 exhibits in 14,000 galleries and about 250,000 exhibits in about 7,000 museums and a bunch of auction data and so on. So this was the raw data. But this one, what it really just provided us is where did the artist exhibit it? And we were curious, how does really value and kind of success emerge in the art? And really the institutions are responsible for that, the galleries and museums, because where you exhibit, where you get the chance of exhibit will very much determines actually your valuation as an artist down the line, in the long run. So we ended up using the career data in an interesting way. So if you take for a particular artist, then you say, well, this artist exhibited first in Plum and Go, and next he was exhibited in Mocha. And after that, he went to MoMA, and after that, he went to Gagosian Gallery. Then you can actually collect these institutions through this artist because it indicates that these institutions have a similar belief of who is a good artist because they accepted the same artist, right? Each institution has curators and perspective of what is the type of art that fits with their particular philosophy and what is the type of artist they can actually attract to the institution. And this, where artists travel from institution to institution gives us a hint of how similar they think about it. So we did that not only for a single artist, but we ended up actually doing it for all the artists. And from that, we got this map. And in this map, it's a network, as you can see. Each node corresponds to an institution. And colors of the institution correspond to what regions of the world they are. And the size of the institution corresponds to the betweenness centrality within the network, which happens to very, very strongly correlate with the prestige of the institution, which is what we find is that the more central is an institution in this network, the more prestigious it is. So here, for example, you have MoMA, here you have a Guggenheim, Pace Gallery and Gagosian Gallery and so on. And then you have a Tate and some of the other European institutions. So this map really describes how the institutions are connected by these hidden connections of having a similar perspective on art. But when you look at it, there is much more to it. You see that there are very distinct clusters. And this is what I would call the high value clusters. That's where all the superstar institutions are. And this is where I'm sitting right now. This is Eastern Europe, actually, very embedded with some American institutions, but also many German institutions, because many German institutions have a strong presence of Eastern European artists. And what you see, and here is where, for example, you have Australia and Oceania in yellow and so on. And what you see there are these very clear islands, meaning that you can be a very successful artist in Eastern Europe, but there are very, very few paths for you to the high value institutions. You can be, pretty much throughout your life, you can have one exhibition to the other one, move from institution to this institution, but these institutions don't appear in the radar screen of these major ones. What's also interesting that you don't, like just being an American institution and being in New York is not enough for you to be in these clusters. Many of the New York institutions are very, very distant from these high value clusters, because their perspective of art is different from what MoMA considers art and so on. Now, the question is, how could we use this data? What is this network good for? And here is just kind of some blow up of that particular data. And we were curious, how does actually a career of a scientist evolve? And there were a couple of interesting, some of them disappointing discoveries. One of them is that if you start high, you end high. That is that those artists who enter in the first exhibits of their career are at very high prestige institution between prestige 0.8 and 1, they more or less stay there. It's very hard to fall down once you start high. But most artists don't start high. Most artists start actually low. They start at the periphery, and some of them slowly built up their career and arrive there, and many of them don't at all, right? So the question is, what is the difference between them? And we actually have specific numbers of that, that if you start high, 50% of them will actually end their career high as well. If you start low, about 60% stays low, 10% goes up, and the rest kind of stays in the middle, and so on. But what most interesting things actually was the fact that this network was hugely predictive whether you will be successful or not in the art space. But if I know the first 5 institutions where you exhibited in, like say these 5 or these 5 or these 5, we can actually fast forward your career using a Markov model. And the Markov model only uses input, that matrix that I showed you, which is actually the network itself. And it's hugely predictive. And to be more precise, here are actually 4 predictions. For this artist, we actually predicted, this is the predicted line, and this is the real data. He started about 0.7 prestige, and we predicted that he's going to go high, and he did. And here we again started high and stayed high. And here's a case where we started low, we predicted to go up, and it did. And here is a case where it started low, and we predicted that it will actually stay more or less low with a small improvement, and it did so. So why does this formula work so well? The reason it works so well is because when performance is not measurable, it is the network that creates value. And this particular network that we mapped out to the career of these many artists happens to capture these invisible links or these invisible networks that govern to a very high degree the artistic success. This is not to say that it's only the network, because your art has to resonate with the current thinking about art or what contemporary art is. If you start actually printing sunsets and sundowns, you know, with the same quality as you see actually 200 years ago, will probably not get you in MoMA these days, right? So you still have a sense of what is contemporary art is about and what is innovation in art. But fundamentally, this network is kind of captures very much what the community's perception is about art and about your art, depending on where they admit you in this particular network. Now, I will probably stop here. I want to acknowledge many of our collaborators. This is actually the group who worked in the artwork. And I should also say that I've written a book. If you want to interested more on this, you can actually learn more about that. And I will want to probably finish just saying that this is actually a part of a larger journey that we have in my lab in the area of science. That is, how do we use kind of data from science to quantify different aspects of science. And if there is only one thing that you want to remember from this talk, I urge you to remember this, which is very humbling, at least was for me when I understood that performance is about you, but your success is about us. So it's a community who creates success and not only ourselves. So we are all within this together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I found it, and I'm sure many share my opinion, that this was really, really interesting. So without further ado, I would like to open the floor for questions, and then we can use the Zoom hand up, and I can assign then who gets to